So this is my whole big Beowulf presentation, but today we're going to look at the first 3 parts. Later on this week, we're going to talk about monsters and heroes together. There's some important symbolism, I think, that's worth talking about when we get to the section where we meet the character of Grendel's mother in the story of Beowulf, who I know you don't know yet, but you will soon, trust me. And then there's some really cool symbolism about dragons that I want to talk about near the end of the story. So this is kind of what's on the horizon. But let's start at the beginning. What is an epic? An epic is a long narrative poem that celebrates a hero's deeds. So I know the first box is a little small. You could put this whole thing in there, but as long as you get that it is a long narrative poem, that's okay. Yes, sir. How'd I do what? There's a little magnifying glass tool. And you hit the arrow next to it and then pick 100% to start with and see if that's big enough. And if that's too small, try 200%. Now, the earliest epic tales survived for centuries as oral tradition before they were finally written down. Your second box, I'm sure some of you are thinking about this. You can put 2 things there. You could either put the stories are about a hero's deeds, or you could write that they're based on historical fact. Those are both true. Either one of those I will accept. But as I was saying, the earliest epic tales were told through the oral tradition. They were poems and they were songs before anyone ever wrote them down. This is something that is pretty much true from culture to culture across the world. Before anybody knew how to write things down, we told each other stories and we learned through poetry and music. And since many epics were based on historical fact, their public performance provided both entertainment and education for the audience. So the stories that we experience and the stories that we read and the stories that we see in the movie theater and on the television play a similar role today still. In a lot of ways, they give us potential role models, right? But before we could write things down, we were telling stories still in music and poetry. And so these oral poets, known in different cultures as scops or bards, drew upon existing songs and legends, which they then embellished or combined with their own original material. So I make the argument that bards, these early musicians and poets, were the first teachers. Might be slow. I don't know, hopefully we can figure out. Try to keep it your mask above your mouth. But yeah, where was I? Yes, so bards. I make the argument that they were the first teachers, and that before we wrote things down and read books and watched YouTube videos, we listened to music and poetry to learn things. So one characteristic feature of oral poetry is the repetition of certain words, phrases, or even lines. That is not the answer to your one question. This is. 2 of the most notable examples of repeated elements are stock epithets and kennings. Stock epithets and kennings. So what are these? Well, let's start with stock epithets, because these are going to be closer to things you've already seen. Let's start with the Greek storytelling tradition. Stock epithets are adjectives that point out special traits of particular persons or things. One example of this is how in Homer, the guy who tells us of the Odyssey, also the Iliad, stuff you should have looked at in 9th grade, stock epithets are often compound adjectives, such as the swift-footed, used to describe Achilles in the Iliad. So you might write, for an example, the swift-footed Achilles. The swift-footed Achilles. Now what? Yes. I think so. The one where it says an example of a stock epithet. Yeah, that you should put that there. Not two examples of repeated elements are stock epithets and kennings. Oh. Stock epithets are the adjectives, that part's right. And then the example you should use is the swift-footed Achilles. I know I ramble sometimes. If it's not written on the screen, don't write it. Just listen. I know that's confusing. First time we're doing this together. So why does Homer do this? Well, this is important characterization. This is how you know what Achilles is about without having to do a flashback and tell you his backstory about how when he was a kid, he wanted to grow up to be the fastest person in the world. No, you don't have time for that because there's already a whole bunch of stuff going on in the epic story. We just say the swift-footed Achilles, and we know this guy's probably pretty fast. And that's maybe his superpower, right? It's also the thing that tragically ends him, right? Because the arrow lands in Achilles' heel. And so then he can't go fast anymore, and that was his strength. So he loses it at the Battle of Troy. Now let's talk about Grendel, the monster from Beowulf, who you're probably a lot less familiar with. Here's some pictures of him, or at least what he may have been imagined as. Now, how are these German poems, these Germanic poems, because understand English is a Germanic language, how do these German epics do this differently? Well, they use kennings. And kennings are poetic synonyms found in Germanic poems, such as the Anglo-Saxon epic of Beowulf. This is the definition. That is not your example. I had a few kids in first and second block write an example of a kenning was Beowulf. That's not true. This is an example of a kenning coming up here. So rather than being an adjective like an epithet, a kenning is a descriptive phrase or compound word that substitutes for a noun. And I will try to explain that in other words here in a second. But it is a descriptive phrase or compound word that substitutes for a noun. And so I think the first and quickest way to explain this is to give you an example and see if you can figure it out. So in the story of Beowulf, this monster, Grendel, is often called the Almighty's enemy and sin-stained demon. And those are two kennings that are used in place of his name. So think about it this way. When we tell a story, when we first need to establish who the character is, it's nice to hear their name, but that could get boring after a while. So what we often do is we start using a pronoun. We'll say he or she or they, whatever, right? Depending on the situation and the character or characters, what have you. Well, what the German poets were doing here is pretty cool. So they will use this phrase instead of the character's name. So instead of saying Grendel lurked across the class, Grendel attacked Jayla, Grendel caused a ruckus, they'll start saying the Almighty's enemy lurked through the class. The sin-stained demon attacked Jayla. It's got a different energy when you start calling them these crazy things. But you're supposed to recognize that that's referring back to the character. And that is a kenning. You're going to see that a lot. So you got a bunch of bullet points after that. So let's go through these. So epics from different languages and time periods do not always have the same characteristics. We just talked about two potential differences. I'm hoping this comes back in a second. But we just talked about two potential differences, stock epithets versus kennings. So the Greek poems have a different characteristic than the Anglo-Saxon or the Germanic poems. Kennings, for example, are not in Homer's epics. However, all epics do concern the actions of a hero who can be described as, and these bullet points, you can take these word for word, being of noble birth or high position, and often of great historical or legendary importance. That is one bullet point. Don't make this 2 lines. That is one line. Being of noble birth or high position, and often of great historical or legendary importance. So when I think of DC Comics, for example, Superman was, I think he was like a prince from the dying planet of Krypton, and his family sent him to Earth so that he could escape the explosion, right? So Superman has this character. He is of noble birth. And so his family kind of matters. You can even look at Batman, right? There's a similar thing going on here, right? In Gotham City, the setting of the Batman story, Bruce Wayne comes from pretty much the richest family in that city, but then his parents are tragically killed while he is a young boy, right? But he has this going for him too. He is from this very important family in Gotham City. And so you will see this. Beowulf comes from an important family too. They exhibit character traits or qualities that reflect important ideals of society. The way they act and the things that they do reflect the ideals of their society. They're kind of meant to be like role models. Not kind of, they are. They're meant to be like role models. They perform courageous, sometimes superhuman deeds that reflect the values of the era. So some of these values can change from place to place or time period to time period. But the thing that is consistent is that the things they do reflect the values of their era. And often the things they do are superhuman. They may have super strength, or they may be super clever. And last but not least, their actions often determine the fate of a nation or a group of people. They perform actions that often determine the fate of a nation or at least a group of people. So why does Batman do what he does? It's to protect Gotham City. Why does Superman do what he does? It's to protect, what is it, Metropolis and the world, oftentimes. Beowulf is also trying to save his nation. Also, nations he's not even from, because he's just that kind of guy. So some of you may notice here, I've got the little image of from Dragon Ball Z here, because these next few points, I'm going to use DBZ as a bit of an example. So I know this particular one's hard to read, so I apologize for that. But if you need to pull it up on your own screen, you can. In addition, most epics share certain conventions, which reflect the larger-than-life events that a hero might experience, such as the setting is vast in scope, often involving more than one nation. The setting is vast in scope, often involving more than one nation. They don't just save their kingdom, they save the world. Or at least the world as they know it, right? This part's cool. The plot is complicated by supernatural beings or events and may involve a long and dangerous journey through foreign lands. That one's got the Odyssey written all over it. But the plot is complicated by supernatural beings or events and may involve a long and dangerous journey through foreign lands. Some of you may not know this about the Dragon Ball series, but it is actually based on a Chinese epic called Journey to the West, specifically about the character Sun Wukong from the Monkey King. His name, Sun Wukong. Goku was based off of Wukong, who was an epic hero from a Chinese myth. So there's a reason why there's a lot of connections here. So for example, in the Odyssey, right, hopefully we remember this, in the Odyssey, Odysseus is sometimes helped by the gods, such as Athena, and sometimes he's hindered by the gods, such as Poseidon, right? So the gods get involved with what he does. What are some other supernatural beings, right? What does this mean? So gods, ghosts, monsters, things of that nature, right? In Dragon Ball Z, Goku literally dies, goes to, heaven for lack of a, basically heaven. And then while he is in heaven, he trains with King Kai, who was like, the ghost of a martial arts master, so that he can become even more powerful in death and then come back to life in order to save the planet after learning stuff from this dead kung fu master or martial arts master. And that's not technically kung fu. I think it's Kaioken, but that doesn't matter as much. But anywho, in the Odyssey, this is a detail you may or may not remember. Odysseus has to travel through the underworld so that he can meet a poet who will tell him how to get back home. That's a detail you may or may not remember from that story, but it's there. So this is all here, the supernatural stuff. It links back. There's a lot of similarities. All right, these next 2 points are kind of related. At least I think it's the next two. The dialogue often includes long formal speeches delivered by the major characters. The dialogue includes long formal speeches delivered by the major characters. So what does formal mean? Kind of. Ma'am, sir. Yeah, so formal, that's an example for sure. Yeah, so formal means it's very serious and it's very important that they're understood and it's not casual, right? It's like the opposite of casual. In casual speech, I might just be like, whatever, like we're talking about Beowulf, like Beowulf be cool, like he'd be a good hero. Like that's casual. Formal is when I'm very careful about what I say and I'm very serious because I want everybody to understand what I mean and to take me seriously. So that's the difference, right? So these characters tend to be very formal. The theme, so it's the next one that's sort of connected, but the theme reflects timeless values such as courage and honor and encompasses universal ideas such as good and evil or life and death. That one's kind of a mouthful. I'll repeat that a few times. The theme reflects timeless values such as honor and courage and encompasses universal ideas such as good and evil or life and death. How am I doing on time? Oh God, I gotta hurry up. All right, I'm almost done. I think I maybe did the math wrong on this. Maybe I'm supposed to go to 115. All right, anyway. Last one. The style includes formal diction, which means the writer's choice of words and sentence structure, and a serious tone, which means the expression of the writer's attitude towards the subject. It's a very serious story, and the characters are all very serious, and the author is very serious in the way he tells it. The style includes formal diction, which means the writer's choice of words and sentence structure, and a serious tone, which means the expression of the writer's attitude towards the subject. All right. So this is from that point in the Odyssey. I'm going to just say a few last words about heroes and why they're cool and what they do. So this is an example from the Odyssey story where Odysseus is tied up to his ship because he wanted to hear the song of the harpies, I think it was, or the sirens. That's right, the sirens. The sirens had a song that they sung that would lead men to crash their ships. And so Odysseus doesn't want to crash his ship, but he does want to hear the song. He wants to know what it sounds like, and he wants to know what all the fuss is about. Why would he do that? Well, if you're young and you're cynical, you might say maybe he was just stupid, but it's more complicated than that. So he has his men put wax in their ears so that they can steer the ship, but then he ties himself up to be careful and not fall prey to the siren song, even though he can hear it. He does this because heroes need to know things that other people are too afraid to even go near. Heroes go and encounter things that scare most people to death. And so he needs to know what this song is like so that, God forbid, he may need to resist it in the future, right? Or something might happen to him later in his life where he needs to resist temptation. He needs to know what temptation sounds like. That's the idea. Let's talk a little bit about Star Wars for a second, and then I'm going to read a little bit from Beowulf. I think I just did my math wrong. I think I'm supposed to go to 115. But anywho, Star Wars is an epic. And one of the cool things about epics is as you get older and as you mature, you can look back to stories like this and you see things that you didn't always see. Or you maybe can put things into words that maybe you always understood, but you just didn't know how to say it. And so one of the cool things I've realized about Star Wars is it's very, very symbolic about what it means to sort of just grow up in some really important ways. So one of the things that is kind of just true about the world is you guys are in it. You're still kind of young, but you're almost like fully fledged adults, right? You're almost there. And you've probably noticed by now that there are certain things about the world and our world's history that seem pretty cool, and there are certain things that probably seem kind of broken. And that's just kind of a truth. Like some things seem like they're good, but some things seem like they could be a lot better. And so the struggle of Luke Skywalker is really representative of this because he has to go save his father. That is symbolic of something. That means he has to understand the past. He has to understand how his father became Darth Vader. Something happened and he needs to understand it and he needs to save his father. But there's also this emperor, right, who runs the empire. And the empire is this like really strict, really militaristic, kind of rigid system that's kind of broken. And so he has to, with the Rebel Alliance, destroy the Death Star and kind of bring balance back to the Force. What does that mean? Well, it means that there are certain things about the past that are worth saving, And there are certain things about the past that need to be restored or need to be edited or perhaps need to be, in some extreme cases, blown up and started over. And as you grow up, you kind of have to figure out what is it that we need to save about the past and what is it that needs to be fixed because it's horribly broken. And by the way, the reason why the empire's broken is because a lot of the systems that we have in our world were created for a time that maybe doesn't exist anymore. We're kind of in this now with school, right? So we've got the way we've always done school, but now technically you could stay at home and get the same work done and learn another way too. Like, it's changing. So as you guys grow up, one of the things you got to make sense of and figure out is what was worth it about the old way of doing things that needs to be saved? And what is it about this new world that, you know, maybe is better? You got to figure that out. So anyway, yeah, Titus, real quick.
Would we be counted as if we were to join like the Google Meet at home?
No, I don't. Other teachers might do that differently. So Titus asked, if you join the Google Meet, do I count you as absent? I don't, because you're here listening, right, technically. And the thing that I care about is, are you getting your work done? Now, if you're not in the Meet and your work still gets done, that's like an interesting gray area. But I will tell you that if you can get the work done and pass this class, I'm not going to fail you because of absences. Like, I will fight for that because, like, that doesn't make sense to me. That's my attitude. All right. So last few points. I got about 4 minutes here. I want you to listen to the way Beowulf sounds. Now, I'm going to read this translation first, and I want you to listen for two things. The first is alliteration. Alliteration is the repetition of beginning consonant sounds. So you're going to listen for the repetition of beginning consonant sounds. So like pa, pa, ta, ta, da, da. Those kinds of sounds, repetition there. The second thing is the rhythm, because Beowulf uses something called caesura, which is the rhythmic pausing of a poem. So listen to this. You're listening for alliteration, pa, pa, ta, ta, da, da, those kinds of sounds. And you're listening for the rhythm, the way I pause and start and stop. That's called caesura. A powerful monster living down in the darkness, growled in pain, impatient, as day after day the music rang, loud in that hall, the harps rejoicing. Call in the poet's clear songs sung of the ancient beginnings of us all, recalling the Almighty, making the earth, shaping these beautiful plains marked off by oceans, then proudly setting the sun and moon to glow across the land and light it. So hopefully you could hear, you know, day after day. I love this one here because it's sort of subtle. Growled in pain, impatient. That hits. That puh is hard, right? The other thing, there's a lot of commas in here, and so I stop and pause on these commas, and so this gives the poem this kind of da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da kind of rhythm. And that's fairly consistent throughout the poem. So very serious, very formal, kind of like almost too serious, right? With that da-da-da-da rhythm. But it's there on purpose. So last thing I'm going to share with you, I'm going to play just a little less than a minute of this. This is what the poem sounds like untranslated. This is what old English sounds like. If you thought Shakespeare was Old English, you're wrong. Shakespeare is early modern English because you can kind of understand what he's saying if you think hard about it. This is what Old English sounded like. Listen for the same stuff, those vowel sounds, or sorry, consonant sounds. You'll hear a lot of was, and fuzz. And then also listen to see if I got the rhythm kind of right. Hear if it does this da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da thing.
In jaar dagum feud kuninga thrimje frunan hutha athalingus ellen fremdon.
Technical issues. I don't know why. I don't know why it does this. All right, let's try again real quick.
What way gar dana in jaar dagum feud kuninga thrimje frunan hutha athalingus ellen fremdon. Oft schild shaving, shathen a threatum, monigum maigthum meru setla ofta, egg so de erlas, suthan arist worth, fashaft funden. Hethas frovra jebad, weox under hocknum, weorth mundum tha, o that him aig wilch thara umsetindra, over hron rade, huran schulde, gomban yildan. That was good kuning. Them avra was, after Kenneth, young in yardrum, thun a god sende fokid frovre. Fear in tharve onyat, that he drugon aldor laze longe wile.
I'm gonna pause there. Hopefully you get the idea. There are little moments where it can kind of sound like, I think the prepositions are still similar. Like den goes, well, it kind of sounds like, you could even hear it in its tone. It was almost like he was saying, then this happened, right? So dan and then are still kind of similar, but most of that stuff doesn't sound like the way we use English today. It actually has more in common with probably like Swedish or Norwegian. If you guys ever heard the Swedish chef from the Muppets talk, it's almost a little bit like that, but actually, right? And so that's where the earliest English comes from. And the very first story is the story of Beowulf, who's from that northern European region around Norway and Sweden. All right. And so that is the end. So make sure that you finish your literature notes and submit that when you're done. Finish any homework you've got. And if you're ahead of stuff, go ahead and start reading Beowulf. You can go click on the homework for tomorrow, and you can find the text in there, or you could listen to my recording.